Greetings, YouTube. This is Remarkable Republican bringing the truth with a truth-flavored bias. As a kid, I was a fan of both the NES and SNES. My parents had to work really hard to acquire these two consoles for our family. And over the years, I've revisited them from time to time. Finally, I decided to really look into what the difference was between them physically. And what I found disturbed and shocked me. It turns out that not only are these two consoles basically the same, but that Nintendo flat out defrauded poor American customers like my parents. There was no reason for a system upgrade. There was nothing that the SNES could do that the NES couldn't. And I'm going to prove that today and talk about why we need to hold Japan accountable for allowing Nintendo to perpetuate this kind of fraud. The first sign of fraud is that both of these two systems use the same amount of energy. They have the same power level. Each of them uses 9 watts of energy. So in 1986, when the NES came out, it uses 9 watts. 5 years later, the SNES comes out, it uses 9 watts. Both of them also use the same big power brick, those square power bricks that were so common back in the 90s. One thing you'll notice is that you don't need two different power sources, and you can put the SNES and NES in the same console. So there have been a lot of later consoles that are just an NES and SNES together, like the one you see here, the Retro Duo. All of the computer chips, for those of you who don't know, in your system all require electricity to run. And the more powerful the chip, the more it does, the more electricity it needs. So the fact that they both use exactly 9 watts is evidence that they are both the same power. Now, there could be that the two systems have some differences in that maybe there are chips in the NES that are more powerful and chips in the SNES that are more powerful, but those were tweaks, not really major changes. There's only so much of a difference you can fit in without needing more electricity. So let's talk about what is the same between these two once you open up the case and look inside. I was absolutely shocked to learn that most of the components in both systems are exactly the same. And what's even more shocking is that the SNES, despite usually looking better on a screen, actually has a weaker color and graphics chip than the NES. And you can see that fully when you use an emulator that allows for making old games 3D. You can do it with an NES, but not with an SNES, and that's because the NES actually has more raw power. Which I know sounds crazy, but it's actually true. Both of them also have a lot of the same components. Both of them can hook up with RF or AV. They both have 2 controller ports. The difference was the advantage of the SNES not only is the controller a little better in terms of having more options, but it also fits more snugly into the system because it has a different hook in. So it has a different mechanical component, but the kind of chips that run it and allow those controllers to work are the same. They also have the same input time. In terms of the main components, the CPU, GPU, and the ROM, it's the same in both systems. The big difference between the two is that the SNES has a better sound chip, so it's able to display sound more clearly and do better instruments. But that came at the expense of removing the Rob the Robot compatibility. Nintendo hadn't done much with it with the NES, and so they took it out of the system altogether, and that allowed them to use more electricity on something else. And so with that and then downgrading the graphics card, they were able to put in a really good sound chip. So that's why SNES games sound so good. But for the most part, we're talking about a very small shift. And there wasn't really that much reason why Nintendo needed to release a new system. They could have just offered to make a few tweaks to the old NES. Anybody's dad with a screwdriver could have made the tweaks that were needed and maybe bought a $20 chip and made the upgrade then. But Nintendo was greedy, and they wanted to take advantage of dumb Americans. The NES and the SNES are way too similar to really justify any kind of upgrade. However, there are some differences in the way that they're laid out, and that accounts for how it feels different when you play. So the NES was originally designed pretty badly. It's designed to look like a VCR. That was considered to be professional and cutting edge at the time. The problem with the VCR design is that it doesn't let the cartridges breathe very well, so they overheat, and also you can't see inside of there, so it's easy for dust to build up in the system, and that's why you had to make sure your cartridges were super clean to get them to run. That's why people had to blow on their cartridges, and other people actually even got cleaning kits to go inside of the system. Later on, Nintendo fixed that problem with the top-loading NES, and in fact, as I'll show, that in itself could have been the upgrade, or the redesign, the reissue. The SNES was totally and completely unneeded. But the redesigned NES top loader worked a lot better, you didn't have the blowing issue, it stayed cool, and it ran smoother. The SNES was always a top loader. This is the second version of it, which looks suspiciously similar to the NES top loader. But again, the main difference is that the top loading design doesn't really have the kinds of problems that the insertion VCR design has. So Nintendo did learn a lesson, but this was really just shifting things around, not some sort of quantum leap in computer technology. The other change between the NES and SNES is that they used a different cartridge. So what they learned over time is not only that they work better if you insert them from the top and have the top open, but also that you need to have as much frontage between the cartridge and the system. So the metal clamps that convey electrical signal need to be more numerous and connected over a broader surface. And so the SNES cartridge did exactly that. So it was shorter but longer, and therefore it actually has more connectivity. It has about the same things inside of it. The difference is that it sends out more signal than the NES cartridge because it has more connectivity. But it's really just the same thing reworked into a different design. So once again, it is a redoing of the NES, and it's not really super in any meaningful way. It's just a kind of more efficient version of it. If you compare this to the Sega Genesis, those cartridges are actually a lot smaller, but because the way that the design is, they did not need as much space to hold things as Nintendo cartridges did. So the SNES will run a little faster than the NES because it's got that greater connectivity. It also sometimes could be loaded down with other things that you couldn't put in an old NES cartridge because it has that greater connectivity. So if you wanted to put in a chip that allowed you to save a game or something, you could do that, whereas you couldn't do that with an NES cartridge because it couldn't control batteries. So this is a fairly major difference, but again, one wonders why Nintendo was not more honest about what the difference was between the two systems. They really should have been called the Nintendo and then the Nintendo Model 2. But instead, they misrepresented the whole thing and called it the Super Nintendo. But again, what's the super part? It's just super optimized, but it's not really super different in any way. And it's not even more powerful. It's the same 9 watts. I always knew that Japanese companies were deeply unethical, but I didn't think that they would go so far as to abuse children in this way. Most console upgrades throughout our lifetime have all been fraudulent. There are very few, if any, differences between the NES and SNES. And that's true of most console generations, by the way. There really aren't that many differences between the power of the consoles of the 80s and the power of the consoles today. The only difference mostly is just the use of more electricity. So it is just hot-shotting. It's not really that much more powerful or better. And companies are deliberately committing this fraud by understating the power of the old consoles and the potential they had, and overstating how much better newer consoles are. So they're just simply lying to sell machines. Next time we'll show that this was not something that only Nintendo did. Sega did the same thing, because actually the Sega Master System and Sega Genesis are even more similar than the NES and SNES. So stay tuned and I will present you with that. I'm Remarkable Republican, bringing you the truth with a truth-flavored bias, signing out, and I'm here to serve the public and to fight deception.